In October 2004, Matt Tocheri was a graduate student studying human evolution at Arizona State. He was at a hotel in London, Ontario, for a biological anthropology conference when he came upon a piece of news that would change his life forever.
I remember coming down one morning, ready to grab a coffee and maybe a small bite to eat before heading to the morning sessions. And I walked past the bar area and I saw a TV off in the distance and CNN was on. I couldn't hear it. And I saw the words come across the screen like new hominin species discovered on some Indonesian island or something like that. And I just thought, that's got to be some kind of joke. There's no way, like, just doesn't sound right. Am I still asleep? Am I daydreaming or something? And then one of my other friends came down and I mentioned it to her and she said, yeah, look at this. And she had actually printed off the paper because it had come out in Nature. And I remember looking at it and I read through it and I sat there and then I just looked up like with this blank stare and just said, wow, what a wonderful time to be alive.
This is Origin Stories, the Leakey Foundation podcast. I'm Meredith Johnson. Matt Tocheri is now a professor of anthropology at Lakehead University. He's a Leakey Foundation grantee who's part of an international team of scientists studying one of the most remarkable fossil hominin species ever found. It's called Homo floresiensis due to its discovery on the Indonesian island of Flores. But it's better known as the Hobbit. In 2003, archaeologists found a single small skeleton in a cave called Liang Bua. They called the specimen LB1 because it was the first hominin ever found at Liang Bua. This tiny human relative radically changed our understanding of the human story. There's a clear dividing line before the Hobbit and after. The same is true for Matt Tocheri's life and what he was learning in grad school. Everything shifted in that moment near the hotel bar.
We were basically always reading stuff that had been published, it felt like decades, eons before. All of a sudden, here was something totally new. And even more than that, even all the professors weren't sure what it was. And so that kind of excitement, the intellectual curiosity that it spiked in everyone you met had a different opinion about it, different idea. There was like a breath of fresh air. Like in many ways, I didn't care one way or another what it was. It was just nice to have something that we all could reach out at and take a few guesses, take a stab at seeing if what we know can help.
No one knew quite what to make of LB1 when the paper first came out in 2004. It was soon after the time that Peter Jackson's first Lord of the Rings movie was released, so the nickname The Hobbit was a natural fit. And these prehistoric hominins seemed like something out of Tolkien's Middle-earth. The Hobbit from Liang Bua was about the size of a 3-foot-tall human child, with a perplexing combination of physical features. A brain only about as big as a chimp's, inside a long, low skull, and a wide face with a short forehead and no chin. LB1 is one of the most complete hominin skeletons in the fossil record. We have the skull and the lower jaw, as well as the collarbone, arm bones, and a lot of bones from the hips down, including most of the feet, which, like Bilbo Baggins's, were disproportionately big. Some parts of the Hobbit looked like a scaled-down Homo erectus, and others were a dead ringer for Lucy, the 3.2-million-year-old Australopithecus. But the Hobbit was originally dated at only 18,000 years old, much closer in time to us today than even Neanderthals. So it was a real puzzle. What was this? How did something with a tiny brain like that come to be on an Indonesian island? Was it actually a different species, or was it an individual with some kind of disease or genetic condition?
I remember the first class back, we were now reading these Hobbit papers, and I can still remember the before, what our discussions were like in that class compared to after. And it was night and day, like something new had, changed each and every one of us in some way. I still never would have thought I would get involved. I mostly was still focused on hominin fossils from Africa. It didn't really cross my mind that it would be something I would go to. Indonesia seemed so far away. And that all changed for me, though, in 2006.
That year, Matt was doing a fellowship at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. He was working on his PhD research, and he spent most of his time laser scanning wrist bones from humans and great apes. His study focused in on one bone called the trapezoid, the tiny little wrist bone underneath your index finger. It was pretty specific.
I can still remember arguing with my roommate. He's like, there's no fossil trapezoids. Don't even worry. Like, there's nothing for you to do. And I kept saying, but you never know. One might turn up. And if one turns up, I'll be ready.
As Matt was writing his dissertation, a conservator named Lorraine Cornish from the Natural History Museum in London came to give a talk to the Human Origins program at the Smithsonian about the Hobbit. She had recently been in Jakarta, helping Indonesian scientists there curate and conserve the remains of Homo floresiensis. And at that time, the Hobbit was the spiciest and most controversial topic in paleoanthropology.
By 2006, this was a huge acrimonious debate. You would go to meetings and people were literally screaming at each other. And there was a lot of uncertainty. Most people, I think, at that point still felt that somehow this was some sort of pathological modern human or something something other than a new, novel species. But most of the debate had been about the brain size. Everyone was so focused on the head.
Matt was so focused on his wrist bone research, he almost didn't go to the talk, but he changed his mind at the last minute.
So I ran up there and I sat in the back, and she started giving the presentation, and she started off with this picture that Bill Jungers had taken, and it was of the whole skeleton, and that had never been published anywhere. You couldn't see any details because it was just they'd laid out the skeleton and then taken a picture. But I thought, wow, like there's hand bones there, and it looks like there's wrist bones. And I thought, those are the bones I have all my comparative data for. And I thought, well, but there's no way to know.
But then the speaker said she'd been interested in testing to see if some of the LB1 specimens' fragile remains might be strong enough to make casts from, so scientists could still study the Hobbit without risking damage to the real fossil. Most of the bones weren't strong enough, but some of the smaller foot and hand bones were.
And she said that, and I thought, don't tell me she made molds of these. And then she said, yeah, the Indonesians agreed we could try making molds of them because no one seemed interested in these particular bones. And so she said, and I made casts, and I actually brought them with me here. This is all within the first 5 minutes of her talk. And so I'm sitting at the back, and I can remember I initially was like leaning back in my chair thinking, okay, now, and then she shows the picture, I lean forward, then I'm like on the edge of my chair. She said, I've got these casts up here and I'm going to send them off tomorrow, but maybe at the end of the talk, if any of you want to come up and take a look at them. And so I honestly still have no memory of anything else from her presentation because my adrenaline and everything was just going like off the charts. I don't even know how I stayed in that chair. But after it ended, I was the first one. I just ran to the room and couldn't wait to look at those casts. So, yeah, I can still remember as she poured them out of the box, they were all mixed together, the hand and foot bones. I could see the casts sort of tumbling out of the box. And because these are the bones that I'd worked on for the past several years, they just jumped right out at me. And I was shocked because, in my head, the idea that Homo floresiensis was either a modern human with some type of pathology or affliction, or maybe it's an island dwarf descendant of Homo erectus.
In that moment, he thought, if either of those ideas are right, the wrist bones would look just like a modern human.
As the casts tumbled out and I saw them, I mean, they they were so strikingly African ape-like that I lost it. I can still sort of remember standing at the table and almost physically feeling my knees go. Like I felt like I was going to fall because it was that striking. And I was shocked that I couldn't understand why this wasn't part of the original Nature paper. These bones were there from the beginning. Why? And I then said, well, just give me a minute. I ran down to my office and I grabbed bones from a chimpanzee and a human and I think probably a gorilla and an orangutan. And I brought them up and I laid them all on the table and showed everyone. And everyone couldn't believe it. You don't need a lot of expertise to recognize that these shapes are just completely different. And it looks like this one. I always call it's a Sesame Street comparison. Which one of these is not like the other? I mean, it was that simple. And at that point, I think the excitement began to wear off and dread set in because I thought, well, I don't have permission to look at these. Now what happens?
Matt had this secret knowledge that the wrist bones of the Hobbit looked just like the wrist bones of an African ape, which meant that he had the key to settle the controversy over whether or not it was a real species. Because there's no way it could be a small human that just happened to have the same wrist bone as a gorilla or chimpanzee. What is a grad student supposed to do with knowledge like that? After some encouragement from friends, Matt emailed Bill Jungers and told him what he'd seen when he looked at the cast that Bill was about to receive. Bill responded and said, "Great, I'll send them right back to you when they get here."
And that's how it got started for me with the Hobbits. All of those things converged. It's 18 years since then, and it changed my life in so many ways. Now I still work in Indonesia. My wife is Indonesian. My kids are half Indonesian. It really made my career do a U-turn in a completely different direction than I ever expected.
Shortly after his email exchange with Bill, Matt got the cast back, and everything accelerated from there. He incorporated the Hobbit wrist bones into his dissertation research, and he presented what he learned at a conference in Philadelphia. Presenting your work is always nerve-wracking, but presenting on The Hobbit at the time was like walking into a hornet's nest.
I still remember it as the biggest presentation I've ever given in my life. Like I can remember people just pouring into that auditorium because everyone wanted to know the latest about Homo floresiensis. Where is it going to go now? And it had an impact. People being able to see what these wrist bones look like helped change a lot of people's minds. And then when we then published that in the journal Science in September of 2007, the tide shifted a little bit from that point. You went from most people sort of thinking that it was something else, like not its own species, some sort of pathology or growth defect, to people then beginning to more seriously consider that, well, maybe this is the real deal. And things just started to build in the other direction. So it was really interesting. And at that point, I kind of thought I was done. But then Mike Morwood invited Bill Jungers to go back and extended that to me as well. And so I ended up going with Bill, mainly just to go get a chance to see the remains themselves. And we stayed about a week, and I enjoyed it and still didn't really think I would go back.
But he was invited again to come back and see the excavations at Liang Bua cave. He planned to go for 2 weeks, and he ended up staying for 2 months.
And next thing I knew, I was becoming more and more deeply involved. And beginning in 2010 and onward, then I was helping to co-direct the excavations. And so ever since, it's been Indonesia half of my life.
Which brings us back to Liang Bua Cave on the island of Flores and the fellowship of researchers who found the Hobbit.
Before I started working at Liang Bua, someone would say the word cave. I have this vision of this dark, wet place that you have to crawl into, and it's dimly lit. Liang Bua is really nothing like that. It's just so wide open that no matter where you go in the cave, it's well lit. It just sort of feels more like you're in a real structure, right? It doesn't really match the traditional version of how most of us think of a cave.
Liang Bua looks more like a rock shelter, but huge, with a soaring ceiling about 4 or 5 stories tall, and an opening that's about twice as wide as that.
You never feel trapped or claustrophobic or anything like that. It's just this really nice, comfortable place to go in the daytime, because if you walk outside of it, within 5 minutes, you're drenched with sweat. It's hot and sticky and humid. And then you walk 2 steps into Liang Bua, and all of a sudden, all of that just disappears from you, and you feel cool and refreshed and comfortable. It's been comfortable for any human or hominin or any other animal for as long as it's been open. So anything alive around there wants to spend a little bit of its day inside that cave.
Including scientists, of course. Researchers have been working at Liang Bua on and off for decades.
Liang Bua had been a major archaeological site within Indonesia for a long, long time. It's been well known as a place that had evidence of past human occupation, but it wasn't until the excavations in the early 2000s where they essentially targeted areas that had been dug previously and just went deeper.
In the 70s and 80s, Raden Soyono, one of the founders of Indonesian archaeology, led excavations at Liang Bua. This became a training ground for generations of Indonesian scientists and excavators, and also set the stage for the team that would eventually discover the Hobbit.
There's always been a large local component of people that live around Liang Bua that work for the team, and many of them had worked at the site for Soyono in the 70s and 80s, and it was either them or their sons or grandsons that were working. And so 2003 is when they found LB1, but they had already found a tooth, an isolated tooth, as well as some long bone fragments that one of the Indonesian archaeologists, Brokis Dueawe, who had been at almost every excavation at Liang Bua, he was a faunal expert, and he was adamant that the tooth and the long bone fragments were hominin. But when Mike Morwood showed them to various foreign researchers, they were all a little bit ambivalent or unsure. And it wasn't until LB1, the partial skeleton, was uncovered in 2003, that then everyone started to realize that something special was going on there.
The day of the discovery was like most others. The team was carefully excavating sections of the cave. They were working on a section that was different from the rest. It contained the charred remains of animal bones, charcoal, things like that. Exciting for an archaeologist. And then more and more animal bones started to emerge.
And not much longer later, they realized that they had hit a hominin skull. And Benjamin Tarus, who was one of our local team members, who's an excellent excavator, was saying to Wahyu, "Oh, there's bone here." And Wahyu would then say, "Okay, let's not concentrate too much in any one place if there's stuff there." And he kept saying, "No, another bone here, another bone here." And then ultimately, "Hey, there's a cranium here. I think we found something important here."
The cranium was so small, they thought it was a child.
But as they removed more dirt and exposed the teeth, it then became clear that, whoa, wait a minute, it's not a child. This is a fully grown adult. And around that time, then they knew they had something really spectacular.
To keep the delicate fossils safe, they cut blocks of fossil-bearing sediment out of the cave and brought them piece by piece back to Jakarta to work on. The lead researcher, Mike Morwood, had already left Indonesia and didn't yet know about the team's dramatic discovery.
It's so hard to think of now, with our world so connected with easy communication almost no matter where you are in the world, social media sharing things. But it was difficult for the Indonesian team even to try and get a hold of Mike Morwood.
They were eventually able to send him a fax with a drawing of the skeleton. After that, Mike invited a specialist named Peter Brown to come and see what the team had uncovered and help them make sense of it.
And he wasn't expecting what he ended up seeing. But within minutes of beginning to examine the material, he recognized how extraordinary it was, and that this was something that just you weren't expecting to find. I mean, we're used to discoveries like this in certain places, like East and South Africa, right? That you might find a partial skeleton like this that has these features. And in those situations, you're digging in contexts which are at least 1.5 million to 4 million years old. Like you're looking at things that are really old. And yet here we are on Flores. Like Flores is not part of the continent. It is an oceanic island that has never been connected to the mainland. How can you find something like this there?
But it was there. This small human relative with a brain the size of a chimp, a skull that was somewhat like our own, and a body with limbs that fell somewhere in the middle, like an Australopithecine, Lucy-like, you could say. Living on a remote island east of Java, and the team initially dated the find to be only 18,000 years old. It was way outside of anything any scientist studying human evolution would have ever imagined living at the same time as us. Years later, new research dated Homo floresiensis to around 80,000 years old.
It doesn't really matter, like whether it's 60,000 to 100,000 years old or 18,000 years old. It doesn't matter. That's still way out of what you expect, right? If you were to find that in Africa, it would be in sediments much, much, much older. And so it's this context of where and when it sort of shows up that just makes it unbelievable. And this is why, it's often referred to as the first hominin discovery that sort of blew up the internet. Like people went crazy at the time because it just seemed out of this world. And it still does in many ways.
So you were really kind of stepping into this controversial but exciting area at the time. And it does seem like every new piece of the puzzle that was looked at closely, like you said, shifted the tide of the conversations that people were having around the Hobbit.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's such an interesting story. Like, I stepped into it like many, I would say the majority of the paleoanthropology community stepped into it, completely oblivious to anything that had happened before. Like it really just came out of nowhere.
In the years since the Hobbit paper was published, the team at Liang Bua has continued to work, and they've learned much more of the Hobbit's story. They've now found remains of around 11 individuals, as well as stone tools and fossils of the animals that lived alongside Homo floresiensis. They've found huge numbers of giant rats and carnivorous storks that towered over 6 feet tall, and tiny elephants called stegodons that the Hobbit hunted and ate. And Matt has also continued to study the anatomy and features of LB1.
From the head to the tips of its toes, all of it adds crucial details. In case after case after case, these are features that we thought disappeared in the human lineage 2 million years ago. And yet we now know, based off LB1 and the other specimens from Liang Bua, that here's a lineage that unless they re-evolve these features somehow, there has to be a record of a continual lineage that will show us that this older way of being a hominin was also just as good, right? They survived into modern times as well. But even from the beginning, I kind of thought, like, no matter what Homo frisiensis turned out to be, the discovery itself made very specific predictions. Like, okay, well, if that's true, then we should expect to find more hominins that look like this, or are similar to it in some way. And lo and behold, here we are. Homo naledi is now on the cards. No one would have thought that was possible. Like, there's another relatively small brain hominin that is existing up until the past few 100,000 years. The list sort of goes on that this is sort of what we should be expecting. There should be a variety of various kinds of hominins that have these different combinations of features that likely survived into fairly recent times. And they didn't all just disappear off the face of the earth 2 million years ago, like we had thought before, in part because that's what the fossil record was leading us to believe.
And now, 20 years on from The Hobbit, the hominin fossil record continues to expand, and so do our ideas about the human past. About how hominins expanded out of Africa, about brains, about so many things. Ideas that trace all the way back to the beginnings of paleoanthropology and the discoveries of Eugene Dubois in Java, when he found the original type specimen of Homo erectus.
And, I always think, what if he had gone to Flores instead? What if in the 1890s he didn't discover the Trinil skullcap, but he found LB1? How would that have changed how we study human evolution, right? But in that instance, like, you could think all of these assumptions that we have, that we're using in our heads, wouldn't even be there if from the get-go there was never this assumption that brain size just gradually increased through time. If that evidence had been staring us in the face from the beginning of paleoanthropology, then maybe we would just look at it in a completely different way. And I think it's healthy to at least philosophically experiment with that and always try and double check, how much of what you think is it due to because you're just following this chain of assumptions versus, well, what is the evidence actually telling us? In the future, I think people will look back and see it as a big shift. Like, there's the before Homo frisiensis and there's after. In part because just the way it shook things up. Like, it was an earthquake, right? And for whatever reason, we're here, yes, and they're not, but they were here up until very recently. And so it'll be interesting to see, how much of that way of being hominin we find in places and times where we also know that we or Neanderthals or Denisovans existed.
Homo floresiensis showed us that it's possible to have small-brained hominins in the genus Homo, and that bodies that were very different were just as adaptive as ours. And the fossil record is clear. There were lots of ways to be a hominin. And while we might be the lone survivors, the Hobbit and other small-brained hominins like Homo naledi were able to survive into recent times, right alongside their larger cousins, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and us. Thanks to Matt Tocheri for sharing his story and the story of The Hobbit. You can learn more about him, his work, and The Hobbit with links in your show notes. Origin Stories is a project of the Leakey Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to funding human origins research and sharing discoveries. Support this show and the science we talk about by going to leakeyfoundation.org/donate and making a donation of any amount. Origin Stories is audience supported and is made possible by listeners like you with additional funding from the Anna Gordon Getty Foundation, Jeannie Newman, and the Joan and Arnold Travis Education Fund. This episode was produced by Ray Pang and me, sound design by Ray Pang. Our editor is Audrey Quinn, theme music by Henry Nagel, additional music by Blue Dot Sessions and Lee Rosevere. Thanks for listening.